Hey everyone, just a quick video here on a little bit about nutrients in plants. There is a question on the final assignment on nutrient use efficiency of plants. Um, and I put that in there just to give you a little bit of an introduction to nutrients since weren't able to cover it this semester. Um, so there is so chapter 6 in the textbook is all on kind of nutrient use and nutrient uptake of plants. And I mentioned this before, but the authors of the book, and in particular Terry Chapin, are spent their entire careers on nutrients, and so I think that chapter of the book is really good, and can probably walk you through things better than I can. So chapter 6 section 4 is where the question really comes from, or the, I guess I should say, the information you need to answer that question is in that section. So chapter 6 section 4. The section 1 and 2 of chapter 6 are also really good sections. They talk a lot more about the physiology of nutrient uptake, and how plants differ in their rates of nutrient uptake. And then chapter 6, section 3 is useful for specific soil conditions. So thinking about toxicity or other types of soils that might have unique nutrient limitations. So that's one that might be a better reference depending on what type of situation you're in, or in the future, if you work in a certain soil type, that section might have some useful information. But as a general rule, most of the information you'd want are in sections 1 and 2 and then 4. So I'll let you read sections 1 and 2 yourselves. If you have questions, I'm more than happy to answer them and we can talk about them. But again, that's really talking a lot of those sections is really talking about the physiology of nutrient uptake, which is really interesting and important. It's especially has a huge impact on respiration rates in plants, because a lot of the things they're talking about are active mechanisms for taking up nutrients. And so it has a big impact on the overall carbon budget of plants. But despite all those interesting kind of mechanics and physiological things, there's like the ability of a plant to either outcompete other plants for nutrients or to survive in really nutrient limited conditions really come down to two factors: the surface area of their root system in the soil, and how they use those nutrients over a long period of time. And of course, in that situation, we're really talking about perennial plants. So there is a very, well, I'm going to say simple, it's not that simple, but a relatively simple way of characterizing the surface area of roots in the soil. And that's with a trait that we call specific root length. So specific root length is the total length of roots divided by the dry biomass. And what that tells us is like how much root surface area can a plant construct below ground relative to how much it invests in those roots. And it turns out that kind of building relatively inexpensive roots, but building lots of root length, is the best strategy for outcompeting other plants. That is the major factor in controlling how fast a plant is going to uptake nutrients. So a plant that wants to uptake nutrients fast should put a lot of roots below ground, but probably build cheap roots. And so a plant that has a high specific root length would be a plant that we would expect to be a good competitor for below ground resources, because a high specific root length means there's a lot of root length in the ground relative to the amount of carbon or biomass that plant invested in that root system. Now, again, we're measuring just total root length. We're not actually measuring surface area, but measuring root length does a pretty good job of capturing surface area. It's not perfect, but for a trait to identify differences between species, it does a pretty good job. So that's one way of kind of understanding how plants might use nutrients, and that's really thinking about fast nutrient uptake. The second one is the nutrient use efficiency, which again would be calculated over multiple years. And so I'm going to go through those calculations because that's what that last question, I think it's question 6 on the final assignment, is related to. So nutrient use efficiency or nitrogen use efficiency, I'm gonna use it for nitrogen in this example, but it could be for any nutrient. But the nutrient use efficiency is really how much a plant can grow per atom of nitrogen it has in its system. And so it's kind of thinking about like how much it grows for each atom in a given year, but then also how much can it recycle those atoms of nitrogen over a long period of time. And that's what it's accounting for. So there's a couple different components to this calculation. So this top bullet point here is nitrogen use efficiency, or NUE, equals nutrient productivity, or NP, times the mean residence time. So let's talk about those. So nutrient productivity essentially tells us how much biomass a plant produces per unit of nitrogen. And so a way, you can get this from different ways, but this is the way that's most commonly used, is that you would take the relative growth rate of a plant and divide it by the nitrogen concentration of that plant tissue. Now, relative growth rate is how many milligrams of new biomass is produced per gram of existing biomass per day. And we use relative growth rate a lot in ecophysiology, and you should really use it all the time in anything you're doing. It's okay to look at absolute growth rate, but you should also look at relative growth rate, because a large plant, I'm using my hands to describe a large plant with lots of leaf area is obviously going to grow faster than a small plant with less leaves. But if you normalize it by how much biomass is there, that big plant isn't always more efficient at growing. So calculating this relative growth rate tells us how good a plant is at growing relative to how much biomass it already has. So typical units, again, are milligrams per gram per day, and you could put these in other units as well. Then the nitrogen concentration of a plant is either in milligrams of nitrogen per gram of biomass, or often moles of nitrogen per grams of biomass. If you do this calculation, what you'll end up with is like milligrams of biomass per gram, you would probably get milligrams of biomass per milligrams of nitrogen per day. That's what your final kind of units would be. And then again, that tells you how many milligrams of new biomass a plant can grow relative to how much nitrogen it has per day. So that's telling us how much it can grow with the nitrogen it has. Then the mean residence time tells you how long an individual atom stays in that plant. So the way you would calculate this is shown in the second bullet point under mean resident time. It's so when I've got nitrogen in the square brackets, that means nitrogen concentration. So you take the nitrogen concentration of the living tissue divided by the nitrogen concentration of the dead tissue times the relative biomass lost in a given year, or average over time. So what this tells us really is, this is kind of giving us an idea of how much nitrogen is reused each year. All right. So the nitrogen concentration of the dead tissue is usually lower than the nitrogen concentration of the live tissue because it's resorbing some of that. So before the plant senesces its tissues, it's taking some of that nitrogen that was in there and kind of reusing it. It breaks it down, stores it, and then it can reuse it somewhere else. So if you divide the nitrogen concentration of the living biomass by the nitrogen concentration of the dead times the relative biomass tells you how much is lost each year. So by multiplying nitrogen concentration of the dead times the relative biomass, it basically tells you, what proportion of the nitrogen is lost every year. So for a perennial plant, this is generally going to be a value that's greater than 1, which means that the plant is reusing each each nitrogen of atom more than once, or more than it's using it for multiple growing seasons. So then when you multiply nutrient productivity by mean residence time, it gives you a nitrogen use efficiency. So plants with a high nitrogen use efficiency means that over a long period of time, they're going to have a really good strategy for growing in nutrient limited systems. All right, so they're going to be best adapted to infertile soils. A plant with a low nitrogen use efficiency might be a really good competitor for nutrients. And in a system where there's lots of nutrients, it doesn't really need to be efficient, right? Because there's plenty around, and so it can waste it and not reuse very much. And there's always going to be in this more nutrients in the soil to take up. But in low fertility systems, a plant that can grow a lot relative to how much nitrogen it has and keep using that nitrogen over time, it's going to be kind of better adapted to those low nutrient conditions. So that's typically what we would see. And again, in section 4 of chapter 6 in your book, it talks more about nutrient use efficiency or nitrogen use efficiency in plants. So I hope that helps you with your final question on that assignment. Let me know if you have questions, and we'll go from there. Take care.